a continuation of the talk I gave last week on sociobiology, and a couple of comments before I begin. First of all, I'd like you to hold off comments and questions until I finish. Hopefully, I'll finish in a half hour or so. Second comment is I happen to be going through some magazines, doing research articles and so forth, and I came across an article in Science, which is a very good magazine that publishes very good science articles on sociobiology of all things. So we are doing research, it's still going on. I'll give you a brief summary of what that one said. So what I'm trying to do today is to update you on things. Because last week was 1975 and so forth to that point. But today I'm going to talk about things that are very recent within the 2020 range. So the article that I found was published last week talked about animals, including humans, and how they congregate under different situations. The article itself dealt with mice under two situations, threatening and non-threatening. And it asked the question, how do mice congregate under these two conditions? Under non-threatening conditions, it was found that both males and females tend to congregate with females. Under threatening, in other words, under survival conditions, both males and females tend to congregate with males. Now, you always ask the question, those are correlations, and I'm a strong believer that correlation is not causation. What's happening in these fields now is that we're trying to get to the actual way that the genes are expressed. What happens under those conditions to cause the particular behaviors? In this particular instance, the authors did some work on the actual neurons that are involved. And what they found was that there was an increased excitability, depending on the situation, with what's called the ventral tegmental area dopaminergic neuron differential projections. Big mouthful. What does it mean? Yeah, the first part, ventral tegmental, means that's the part of the brain that gives these neurons projecting their axons onto their targets for synapses or for the release of neuroendocrine substances. And in this case, it's dopamine that they're doing. And what they showed was that these particular neurons have different projections, that is, different axons going to different regions of that part of the brain that activate under those two particular conditions. So we're coming up to date. We're getting a lot more information. I think it does dovetail well into what's happening in sociobiology. So going on, we're going to go to a book written by Catherine Page Hardin called The Genetic Lottery: Why DNA Matters for Social Equality. Catherine is hold on a second. Okay, she's at the University of Texas, Austin. She got a PhD from the University of Virginia in behavioral genetics. So what's happening is that she's studying, from a psychological standpoint, the role of genetics and through its expression on the different behaviors. Turned out that I had read a portion of the book that I'm going to talk about today some time ago, and I came across a YouTube video that she just made last December. I think it's December 8th of 2024. So if you want to go on, you can hear her give a talk. It's about a half hour long. She'll say about the same things I'm going to say, and she'll amplify, and I'm sure do a lot better job than I do on what she's trying to talk about. So I want to go on to what's happening, how we're doing the research now. Okay, the research today is being done a lot with what's called single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're known as SNPs. This term has been around at least 40 years or more. What it amplifies talks about are single nucleotides within the genome that have been replaced. So, for example, if there's a guanine at a particular place in a particular gene, that could be replaced with an adenine A, T, thymine, C, cytosine, either of those three. Or it could be deleted, or it could be added. In most cases, in this research, it's a replacement. Today, the research is going beyond that somewhat, in the sense that we're going into larger and larger areas of the genome. So we're talking about 3 to 5 to 10 nucleotide sequences. They're starting to look at that as part of the genes, and they're making analyses as they're comparing one genome to another. Big thing about research today is that it has become so much faster, so much cheaper, and you can do individuals so quick today. So we're getting a lot of data in the last, I'd say, 5, 7, 8 years. And it really is expanding in how much information, how this is coming out. A lot of people working on it now. We're getting a lot of information coming along based on these kinds of research. So SNPs are very common. You'll see that a lot from now on as time goes on. Another area, there we go. Another feature that was used, and this is now where we're looking at behavior, we're looking at other genetic traits called the polygenic index. What that is the position, number, and weight, or how important the particular mutations are in a given person's genome. Person's genome is sequenced and then compared to what's called a quote-unquote normal genome. If there are mutations in particular areas of the genome it's assigned a particular number. Those numbers are put together to form what's called a polygenic index. The numbers may be more important than others, in which case a weight was given to them. So this is going to be a weighted index that's given. Today, most of the work is done on mutations that take place within the actual gene. That is, that portion of the genetic code which codes for the protein. We're not talking so much yet in the areas of the gene of the genome outside of the protein expressed part of the genome. But more and more is happening now, so you're going to see a lot more coming out. It's a tangle of information that's occurring. So we're going to talk about the polygenic index to some extent. And then finally, the other aspect of the genome that's looked at is what's called a genome-wide association study, or GWAS, or as I like to define it as GWAS. This is where we're taking groups of people, populations, and so forth. We're doing correlations of genetic attribute that we're talking about, typical behavior happens to be, with the social and overall organism attribute. In other words, we're taking behavior of a lot of people, we're looking at their polygenic index, and throwing this all together to get what's called GWAS. Okay, now let's go on to yeah, okay. Let's talk about the genes now. Talk about genetics. First thing, this goes back long before the genome was even sequenced. We all know that human attributes are genetically inherited. For example, height, weight, body type, that is polymorphic aspects of hair color, eye color, often is associated with your parents, grandparents, and so forth. A lot of research is done on siblings, maternal and fraternal twins, that is identical, non-identical twins. You see much stronger correlation between identical and non-identical. As you well know, if you look at twins, they look a lot alike. They have the same hair color, same eye color, same height, same build, same weight, usually the same sex. There are so many attributes that humans have that seem to be based on heredity. Since that time, since let's say the 1960s and so forth, more and more mutations within the human genome are now correlated with diseases. One of the best known is one we talked about last week, sickle cell disease, a single mutation that takes place. It has both positive and negative attribute to it. Tay-Sachs disease, Huntington's chorea, various cancers, the BRCA gene for breast cancer, the prostate genes in males, various other kinds of cancers, various parts of diabetes, heart diseases, asthma, I can go on and on. More and more, we're seeing that there's at least a correlation between the human genome and diseases, both in the gene that is the cause, or at least the underlying feature that's causing the disease, and also how we are either fighting the disease or the disease is being manifested through these genes. More and more, we're seeing that there's more than one gene involved. There's a cluster of genes. There are many genes that are involved, but they're all there. They're part of the gene. All right, now I want to go to the first study that Catherine Hardin talks about. It's not her study, but it's one she points out in the book. And this is one where the investigators looked at wealth, that is, based on the value of the home, your physical and monetary assets, that is, you have a car, you have a TV set, whatever, it has a certain value to it. You've saved money in your 401k, whatever it is, those are assets. You put all that together, you subtract the debts, that's the wealth. That was correlated against individual genetic variants associated with educational attainment. In other words, they took individuals, they mapped their genes, they got a polygenic index from each individual's genes, and they correlated that and associated that with the educational attainment that person had. In other words, what degrees did the person get? Not how many years they went to school, but how many degrees did they have, and so forth, postdoctoral and so forth. Okay. So they took 1 to 2 adults, aged 65 and 75. They were white, they were both male and female, and they were retired. What they found, first of all, is people in the first quartile of the polygenic index had $475,000 less wealth than the people in the top quartile. People in the top quartile, according to this index, are almost $500,000 wealthier than those in the bottom, based strictly on the polygenic index that was attributed to them before they even looked at the wealth. Now, next, people one standard deviation higher on the polygenic index, they'll get 25% of the wealth. But you talk about the standard deviation, 2/3 of people, assuming a normal distribution, 2/3 of people lie around the median. So if you're one standard deviation above, if you're above that, you're in that right-hand region, way above one standard deviation. Those people have 25% more wealth than people below them. When they take people with the same number of years of schooling, that is not based just on the attainment of a degree and so forth, they found that the standard deviation polygenic scores with only an 8% wealth increase. So what we're getting down to fine details showing that this particular, under these conditions, under this situation of the study, shows that the actual attainment of degrees has more to do with wealth than the number of years of education, than that particular polygenic index. Just to push it further and say, well, look, a lot of this has to do with the environment. I mean, these kids grew up in a home where the parents were trying to help their kids, so forth. And once they saw that they were going to school, they just promoted it. They sent them to private schools, so they paid their way through a private school or whatever it was. They sent them away, whatever it is, for postdoc and so forth. But in this, but they carried it further and said, in a parallel sibling study, those two people coming from the same family, the sibling with a higher polygenic index score was wealthier than the sibling with a lower polygenic score. In other words, nailing down further the fact that particular genetic attributes that the individual had correlated much more strongly with wealth than those that had a lower. Even though it comes from the same family, the same genetic heritage, so they don't have the same genes, that's what happens. Again, what I want to emphasize is these are correlations that go on. It doesn't mean you're going to have that. It doesn't mean that if one comes from a background that does not have a lot of development in love that they can't attain it, they can't become wealthy. They can. But what it does say is that genetics, there's an underlying genetic core that contributes, or at least is there, that I think we take advantage of. We don't know it at the time, but I think this is what happens. Okay, the next study was one that was done based on educational attainment. In behavioral psychology, education is one of the most studied areas of all. It goes back to IQ tests, Stanford Binet score, and so forth. There have been a number of studies in behavioral psychology talking about educational attainment, education, and trying to tease apart how much of education, how much people attain is based on genetics versus just environmental conditions when you grew up, your surroundings, your school systems, and so forth. A lot of work has been done. In this particular study, it was found that the GWAS, that I talked about before, when you're getting this population, associated the apologetic scores of these populations against actual education attainment. And in this situation, we're talking about areas where they actually are studying what goes on in the brain. So that the GWAS plus the synaptic neurotransmission and neuroion channel activity studies were used. In other words, they're looking at particular synapses, what's being expressed with those synapses. It might be dopamine, it might be some other neurotransmitter. And then they're also looking at the actual activity of those neurons. And so when they say neuron ion channel, they look at the activity of the propagation of the impulses in those neurons. So they took all that together. So we're looking at not the genes, not just the genes. We're looking at some of the manifestations of what those genes will cause to be expressed and happen within life of the body. The study showed that these genes are expressed prenatally. Before birth, those genes are expressed and they go to particular neurons that are being studied. Okay, so even before birth, prenatally, those genes are expressed, those neurons are being formed, developed, and so forth. The cognitive effects that they looked at appear at different ages. So those people who are high on the polygenic scores correlate with talking at age 3. People who talk early usually are going to have higher education according to this, at least in the correlation. Their IQ scores show up, and they show up early on. So when a person is 5, the IQ test is given, and there's a high IQ that shows up at age 5. Again, that correlates with the genes and with education. So they look at what's called executive functions. Executive functions has become a much more popular term that's used a lot in education psychology, as well as just general psychology. It's a sort of a general, to me, it's a nebulous term. It's a pretty sort of a general term to see how people function in real life in a day-to-day activity. So they're talking about, for example, how people, and you can think about this yourself, how this applies to you, either positive or negative. I'll let you make your own decisions. How you can keep attentive to a particular task, in other words, your regulation of attention, and you focus on something to the detriment of other things going on around you. Right? You have a higher executive function if you can do that. If you can stop yourself from doing things, in other words, you're not going off the deep end and doing something, and you just jump to it because of a reflex. If you can hold off on that, if you can mentally keep yourself from doing that, you have a higher executive function. If you are talking about rules that are there, they're hidden often, there's something that are assumed and so forth. And if you can flip from one rule to another pretty quickly, you have a higher executive function. If you can update the information that's coming in real time, in other words, you can multitask. You can bring things in from various places relatively easily, quickly, and many sources of mold, the better you have a higher executive function. If you can keep small amounts of information in working memory, in other words, you're working on something and all of a sudden something happens and it just pops into your head that there's something in the back of your mind that comes along with you. That's working memory. Happens to be there, that you just bring it in. If you can do it quickly, sort of logically without even thinking about it, that's higher executive function. It turned out that these features are 100% critical, at least according to the psychological research is done. And again, there's a lot of papers published. So it looks to be pretty strong. It's often manifested by people doing better on tests, which you probably all know. Sorry about that. You do better on tests, and of course, if you do better on tests, you're rewarded. Your parents say, "Yeah, you got to go on to school." Your friends say, "Yeah, you should go on and get a PhD," and so forth. Because that often happens with people with higher executive functions. Again, I want to emphasize that doesn't mean if you have a lower executive function, you can't attain all this. You can. It's just that heredity genes are correlated with the ease and ability to carry this out. I want to say that in addition to this, these scores correlate with so-called non-cognitive skills, such as you're open to novel experiences, and you don't think about it, but you are open to novel experiences. You're a curious person. You like to learn. You prefer gratification. You're going to make a lot of money, but you're not necessarily. But you may not want to make money. You prefer gratification. All these things. Again, education and attainment is one of the big things that happens. So that's what this stuff is about. Education. I want to also emphasize that these genes also have deleterious effects. They correlate with schizophrenia, bipolar disorders, anorexia, obsessive compulsive disorders, and so forth. That's another thing that behavioral psychologists recommend. So, not a one-way street. So beware of the fact that you have this traits. You might be more susceptible to some of these other attributes that are not so great. So, with that, I want to finish with a couple of admonitions. One is that genetics is not tested. Because one is unfortunately given the genetic doesn't mean that's how you're going to turn out. And maybe you have proper genes and proper polygenic index that you should be president of the United States. So, but destiny says you're not going to do that. That's what happens often. Things that you do work on, things happen and whatever. But even though it's not destiny, well, it gives you the fact that you can't ignore it. You know, it's just there. To me, you take advantage of the fact that that's what it is. Let's study it. Let's see what it is. And as Catherine points out in her book, she really emphasizes this, that we in society should be aware of the genetic load that we all carry. But because society has various values, we are taught those things, that we should try to make society work in that direction. In other words, even though the environment might shape the way that our genetic load will take us, or at least our offspring, that doesn't mean that today, tomorrow, the next day, that we shouldn't have society going in a variety of directions that society should dictates what we should do. We just have to decide about that ourselves. So with that, I'll stop. Let you ask questions or comments.
Dick?
Yeah, go ahead.
One slide back, there was a bullet called executive functions.
Yeah.
So I understand the point that is in that bullet, but the values that are listed in there are really subjective to a like a Western society.
Well,
Thinking there might be societies where they don't, those executive functions would be very different.
like I said, this particular area has been studied a lot, and they are going to various other societies, Asian societies, for example. Africans, much more difficult to get through. There's a lot of studies now. When I first saw this, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I became aware of that term. I didn't think much of it. I didn't think it was real either. But more and more data is coming along, and it is cementing what's being shown here. And like I say, without, in fact, I have a number of several thousand people, many thousand people. And again, you try to make it so that you weed out all these other behavioral or other things that might bias you. You try to get the biases out as much as you can. They're getting better, and it's not perfect. They're getting better. They are going to different places, and it's showing up more and more. They're becoming more stronger as time goes on. It's not weaker. It's so.
Can I give you an interpretive question? You see if you can answer it. I once did a study on presidential candidates dating back to 1900, and the two Republicans and the two Democrats, and approximately 80% of those groups of each election had one person who had spent some time in an Ivy League school, which, and the thousands of, I don't know how many colleges there are, there's an awful lot of them. How could that be?
You know as well as I do how that could be. We self-select. Our society selects for this.
But my point is that the selection doesn't occur when you're 48 years old running for president, or 55 when you're running for, it occurs at a very young age, the selection.
Well, no, the selection doesn't occur. You're put in.
They were admitted to Harvard, they were admitted to Yale, they were admitted to.
Yeah, but they're put in these various categories, and it just happens today.
But the selection in the society occurs at a very young age. It doesn't wait.
Yeah,
But part of what you're saying, Jerry, I think,
it's not
is that-
genetics that's doing it.
it's that the selection to go to college is perhaps genetic. It's in your, it's built into your genes
To
because
go.
of your family, to go to college. Full stop. You end up going to Slippery Rock State College in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
The probability of you running for president at some point in time in the future is probably very small.
It didn't make the
What-
cut at a very young age.
Because the people you met and the people that influenced you at that time in college did not allow you to explore that possibility.
And the converse also being true.
And going to a school that in fact breeds politicians, if you will, you know, you're looking at the Ivy Leagues, is the converse.
But now in
That's
England-
my opinion. I'm basing it on zero data.
Probably, but in England, they take these exams to get, what are they, 13 or 14, whatever it is. And that determines your whole,
Well, it's not even
pathway.
England, it's lots of other countries too.
it determines your whole pathway.
That's right, good, bad, or indifferent. And if you're a late starter, you're screwed.
Right.
You know, if you know you're a child genius, it's okay. You're going to Oxford at age 7.
Right now, but it can be that those traits that Dick is talking about are recognizable at very young ages. You don't have to wait until they're 30 years old to figure it out.
Right. And I think what Dick is trying to say in his presentation is that at some point in time, you prick your finger, you get the DNA out of your blood, they look at a certain place and say, okay, you're going to Oxford. So this is what we do. You know, this is at birth.
Right, they test for PKU, they
The hell with that. Whether
test
you get a
for
liver die is a
proteinuria,
different issue.
and what
You're
college you're
going
gonna
to
go
Oxford.
to.
Maybe I oversimplified it, but that's what I'm understanding, part of what you're saying.
Yeah, it's in politics in particular, in this country in particular, we select not on the basis of personality to any major extent. It's based on culture. It turns out that, to me, there's two populations with the composition. Those who want to be, and they're very young, and they just decide to go in particular pathways, because historically that's got them. I think more people don't decide to do that until they're much further along in their education, or at least in their bachelor's And in a law school, for example, why law school? Well, because it was necessary, but it turns out to be very important in order to carry on legal studies and to oversee the legal establishment. Yeah, it's important to do that. But it's not, you're not destined to do it because of your genes. It just turns out culturally that's how it works out. We haven't broken away from that yet, and we'll continue for the foreseeable future, as far as I can tell. There are people in states, state governors and so forth, and I can tell you from experience of my own state, that that's the case, where people who who did not go to an Ivy League school are elected state governors and so forth. Let me go further with this and talk about in the sciences and those of you in academia pursue with themselves here for years. I have found that academic institutions, there's a hierarchy in academic institutions in terms of whether you attend as an undergrad, as a grad student, postdoc, so forth, your ability to get jobs in, let's call them more prestigious institutions. The correlation is very high that if you have some affiliation with those schools, you will get those jobs. Don't have that affiliation, you got a postdoc for many years, you're going to drop out, you're going to go to private industry, which is great, because they like great research on government labs and so forth. So there's that kind of hierarchy that goes on in academia, and it's been that way from my experience, at least for 75 years or more. It continues like that.
But that's a different issue, Dick, in my
It's the
opinion.
same issue, I think.
Well, I'm gonna suggest it's related to what you're talking, but it's a different issue. I think it goes back to the people you associate with and have exposure to in those institutions create a club, and I'm using that word in quotes, that allow you to continue networking in a certain vein that then opens doors that permit you to have access to certain endeavors.
That's true, but I've
And then
sat
it's
on
up,
committees.
it's up to you at that point in time to then do the right thing and be successful once the door is open.
I've sat
Look
on-
at the prime ministers of England,
sat
almost
on-
all of them
I've
went
sat
to
on-
Eton.
I've sat on committees where everything looked to be equal, but because they happen to have a particular category,
Yeah.
that tipped the scale.
Absolutely.
They had done all the work, you know, they were just as good as the other people who were applying.
Was Eton all men then?
Because of the pedigree.
That's the old boys club
It did
stuff.
not have to do with the fact that they were interacting with different people necessarily, because they were interacting, they were doing good work and so. Interaction has a lot to do with it.
But doesn't that go back to the beginning of the world? Is that some farmer some farmer or some caveman in the middle of nowhere,
Oxford.
you know, may have discovered fire, but if he didn't have the right people to be able to share it with and get it exposed, it didn't go anywhere. You know, until you get a critical mass of people understanding what you're doing and able to communicate your thoughts and needs and be able to share your intellect, no matter what you have, it's going nowhere. You know, the next Einstein could be sitting in in Micronesia someplace, but because you're not exposed to anything, you're never going to understand it.
Peter, we were looking at the prime ministers of England. Most of them went to Eton, which is the most exclusive school, but Thatcher and Rishi Sunak did not go to Eton. They went to Oxford, which is like going to Yale rather than to Harvard. Good point.
Right? It's the same thing here. I mean, you end up going to one of the Ivies or Stanford or some other well-known institution, and it's the club. You know, especially the law schools.
I just like to suggest that these kind of studies are highly subjective, and there's no chance you're ever going to answer the question for real. But there's lots of interesting anecdotes, obviously. So if you just look at the number of people who have won Nobel Prizes in the sciences, I'll throw uh, the Peace Prize out of there because it's very political. But if you just look at them, how many of them uh, are related to other people who had Nobel Prizes in the sciences? And it's a substantially higher number than just the random, kind of distribution of Nobel Prizes. But is it a matter of genetics, or is it a matter of some other characteristics that might have been involved? And I would like to always bring up the famous case, of course, of the collectively uh, integrated in one mass family that began with Maria Sklodowska, uh, married Pierre Curie, uh, gave rise to another generation of Nobel Prize winners in Pierre Joliot and Irene, uh, who were the daughter of the Curie Sklodowska family, and the external guy came in as Joliot. And between those four people, there are five Nobel Prizes, and that's pretty extraordinary. But the backgrounds came from all sorts of different things. Now, Marie's father was a professor. Her sister was a medical doctor. So you could say, well, there's maybe some sort of a genetic connection over there. They went through a lot of hardship in terms of getting to a position of importance in Poland, because at that time Poland was, partitioned among various European powers, and some were more or less supportive. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was more supportive than the Russian Empire was, and so Pierre, came through the French tradition. He had some amount of academics and stuff in his background, but Marie didn't get anywhere until she went to Paris, and then of course she became, a superstar. But then of course they had a son. I'm sorry, a daughter, who got to be having two Nobel Prize parents, pretty rare phenomenon. And so did she get focused into going in the direction she went because of the fact that everything that she heard at the dinner table and whatever was about, sophisticated physical sciences? And then what would have happened had Pierre not been run over by a unfortunate cart? And would he have gotten a second Nobel Prize for his work with magnetism? So he would have been right in the same category as his wife. But I think that's an example. The Thompsons, of course, father and son. The Braggs, father and son. And there's a couple more of them. But that's clearly out of the ordinary. But everyone who gets a Nobel Prize, I think you have to say, is probably way out of the ordinary and the tail of the distribution function. Anyway, so I contrast that with, I can't say category. I would put myself in the same category as them, but I did, have a situation in the sense of our family. Neither of my parents had PhDs, but my father had two masters and my mother had a master's, and we all three of us went to MIT as undergraduates, and all three of us managed to get PhDs from somewhere. So would you say, is that the normal distribution for people, even in a community that espoused good education in West Hartford, where I grew up? I think that was probably a little outside the normal distribution as well. So I think it's very subjective.
And that sounds like the normal distribution for Lexington.
Yeah, it's well, West Hartford and Lexington were, both in the when I was growing up there, regularly were highly reputed on the national scale for the quality of the education. And I think there was five people in my graduating class who went to MIT from West Hartford.
Yep, yep.
So yeah.
Uh,
You made Adam, you made a successful crosswind landing, and we'd like to hear from you.
I did. So one theory I've read on this, which I find reasonably persuasive, is a big piece of the career choices that people make wherever they're from. Strategically, it's about which hierarchies do you choose to climb, and which hierarchies do you even know exist that you then choose to climb. So I might argue, just to take Ted's example, since he recently spoke, he did well, obviously predisposed, and I'm sure there are genetics involved as well, but we all know that MIT is a hierarchy you can choose to climb. And if you're ambitious and able, you can do that. Somebody on the West Coast might feel the same way about Stanford. Someone born in a violent society in an inner city or a different country might choose to climb the hierarchy of the local gang. If you want to be, if you're born to a certain class in England and you're sent to Eton, your local hierarchy is Eton, Oxford, head of the Oxford Union and the Conservative Society, politics, prime minister. So the interesting stories are the people who discovered hierarchies that they might not have naturally been introduced to. You can think about it in any field, law, medicine, whatever. It often doesn't even occur. It's not so much that people necessarily don't have opportunities. They don't even know that a hierarchy exists to be climbed. And that's where opportunities can be missed for people. I thought that's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, you're right. It sounds like it's similar to what I was positing earlier, in that you end up in a situation where you're exposed to people who have had the right kinds of connections, the right kinds of background, the right kinds of reading that let you allow you to think about even pursuing those kinds of careers and those kinds of things. If you're not exposed to it, you don't know what's available, and you just have no clue about how to take the first step. Interesting point. Anybody else? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I'd second that statement there, because I think the examples you see when you go outside your normal environment and you realize that not everybody has had the same exposure to the world than you have. It's kind of a shock the first time you see it. I was able 12 years ago, 13 years ago, to spend almost a month in India giving a series of workshops on systems engineering. And the culmination of the workshop was to program this little device that consisted of some sensors and a bunch of vertical LEDs in a vertical column that you would take and shake it back and forth like this. And because of the persistence of vision, the one column of LEDs could produce text or numbers or whatever. And it could be easy to understand if you understood all the details. We didn't have time to go through all that in the workshop, but the net result was we went to this one engineering college that was essentially an all-female student base. There were men in the faculty there, and so these were all highly qualified computer science students who had essentially never touched hardware. They had all kinds of theoretical understanding of things. And they behaved like little kids I'll say, under the Christmas tree, though I know that's a cultural misappropriation probably. And in that the response, when they saw that when they wiggle this thing back and forth, they could see this thing presenting text that they had entered into the system, basically. it was just amazing to see this because I took for granted I had pieces of various kinds of hardware in my hands when I was, well, maybe 4 or 5, 6 years old. I was making bells ring in the basement and things like that. These women had never had hardware in their hands. They, played with keyboards, obviously, but they had never had a piece of circuit board in their hands. Now, when we were doing the same kind of thing in an engineering college that had a lot of men in it, in the student body, they had been exposed to little bits of circuit boards and things like that. And the response was, they were impressed, but it was not the same.
So just, Ted, just to take your point a little bit, the two different cohorts that you were dealing with, were they equivalent in every way except for gender, or they were different in other ways that could have been causative, if you will?
Well, yeah, it's one of these things very hard to make a comparison because we essentially did 6 of these workshops starting in the north and progressing south. And everything changes in India as you go from the north to the south. The women were essentially at almost the far south, the most southern point. We were in Hyderabad when we were at this women's college, and there was not a direct comparison. The next place we went to was in a very rural place, and it had a very different kind of a background ethos to it and stuff. And in India, where you're born, has a lot to do with how your life evolves because of it's very tribal society still in many ways. So there was no way to make a direct comparison, but just the response to people who essentially had never seen hardware, they had only seen software, was maybe that was more important than anything else.
Understood. Anybody else? Any issues? Questions? Comments? This is your time, so to speak. It's a hurry. The world is good, huh? All in favor of world hunger?
Hopefully people will take what we've been discussing the last couple of days and think about it a little bit more than maybe you have in the past. Keep your eyes and ears open to the research that's coming out in these fields. Hopefully we get away from biases and get more and more based on the actual biochemistry that's going on, molecular biology that's going on there. See where it leads. See if it helps us or hurts us. I don't know.
So the solution is gene insertion.
Well, I didn't want to bring that topic up. And so I don't think I'll take the bait.
Dick, I'd also like to point out a footnote on the history of trying to make these kinds of correlations and why among some communities, sociobiology is so controversial. There is a history of bias, as you say. There is also a history of outright discrimination by law and by tradition. And those are not really based upon genes as we know them today, but upon outward physical appearance. And so you've got to be very careful about how you determine what really is correlated and what really is causal.
One of the things that, one of the terms that's bandied about in this field is eugenics.
Yes.
That has a very bad connotation historically, as
Just
we
a
all
little.
know. Yeah, just a little. Catherine Hardin talks about that a little bit in her book. I happen to agree with her on it, that hopefully we get away from the bad connotation. It does have a bad, I don't want to use it, I don't think it's good. I agree with you, Bob, that there's been a tremendous amount, and it's not good in society to have all the biases that are built in on this. And I am a strong proponent that we alleviate that But her point is that we've got to be aware of it and counter it. We should do it, by thinking creatively and thinking, being alert to it, being aware of this fact that these biases are there, and let's try to eliminate that as much as we can. So I 100% agree with you, but we've got these terms are going to change. And what I was trying to point out in these two talks is that the role of genetics, in other words, what Ed Wilson was doing 50 years ago, showing that genes do have a role, evolution is occurring and will continue to occur. So we should be aware of that and just take it into consideration.
One other factor to be considered is, which is completely the opposite of genetics, is birth order. Like in the book Born to Rebel, where birth order has meaning firstborn and not firstborn, has a great influence on behavior.
There's been lots of studies on birth order.
Yeah.
At least there's history there.
Yeah, yeah.
Wasn't there a Tom Cruise movie? I think it's Tom Cruise, where they were arresting people before they committed crimes because they knew they
Yes,
would.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's what comes to mind when you talk about this
The
stuff.
Born to Rebel
Minority Report.
Minority Report.
They
Thank you
used
very much.
real data in birth order and what people chose. The firstborns tend to be institutionalists, and secondborns, we mean not firstborns, tend to be the travelers, the linguists. They tend to find alternative styles, and that completely goes away if the children are separated. They're both raised as, say, firstborns in two different families.
Yeah, interesting stuff. Interesting.
Also a movie called The Matrix.
Yeah, that had a little bit of that too.
Well, in science,
Some guy that didn't have the right genes was trying to become an astronaut. He was go around finding hairs and stuff from other people. The
Well-
DNA in them, I think.
I was more interested in the one pill that makes you larger and the other makes you small.
now that's all science fiction, but it was noted that now scientists in the era of Darwin all published whether they agreed with it or not. I mean, that was a big hot topic. And a second-born, meaning not first-born scientist, was 8 times more likely to accept Darwin's new theory than the institutionalist firstborns. And they didn't look at their birth order when they wrote their opinions.
Interesting stuff.
Well, I had an opportunity to participate in an experiment unintentionally, but there was a gap between when I was born and when my middle brother was born. And it was sufficient that when he was 5, I was a young teenager. And so I decided to make my brother a guinea pig in an experiment. I said, well, maybe I can, build him in my own image in some highly hubristic fashion. And so I set upon putting things into his hands that if I had had a chance to get them at his age, I would have been, amazed at the prospects of things and then beyond grateful. And so it worked. Now, would it have worked whether he had had those exposures to things early on, electronics, or not? I don't know. No way of testing, obviously, these things. It's part of the problem of these soft sciences is you can never do a real experiment. You try something, but you can't rewind the clock and try it, in a different manner, or take another person who's identical to my brother and not do what I did. But he did very, very well, and of the 3 of us, he got his PhD from MIT also, not just his undergraduate degree. So, and now, of course, he works for Google, and I have no idea what he's doing, but they're very tight on what they do.
All because of what you did.
Yeah.
But Ted, you're right. Yeah, this is Dave Kahn. You're right on. When I was a kid, when you go to the movies during World War II, they would show in the news, they're trying to find a downed pilot in the middle of the ocean. It didn't make a difference which ocean. You couldn't find the guy. So that fact alone inspired me to become an engineer. There had to be a better way to find people, in the sea, like using the radio that they did have, but how do you really find them?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's one more anecdote. I'll just, my mother used to tell this story all the time, and she really enjoyed it. She passed away 20 years ago, but she was at a parent-teacher uh, session, and she was attending this one class for what was newly introduced into the curriculum, what we would call STEM today. Probably it was an electronics course, and this guy had taught electronics to adults. It was the first time he's teaching electronics to students at the not grade school, but middle school, early high school kind of level. And he singled out my mother in this room filled with parents, and said, Mrs. Kochansky, I just want everybody to know that your son Rex, he was the biologist in our family, it was the sharpest student in electronics that he had ever encountered. And my mother, without batting an eyelash, essentially said, "Oh, really? His brothers think he's a dummy," because we did. Yeah, he was a biologist, right? And so the teacher said, "I'm just sorry I missed encountering his brothers," and he had just missed because my brother Greg, who's just a couple of years older than Rex, had just been in that same state of the educational program, except that that class didn't exist the year before. But any event, so and you never know what causes these things to go the way they do. It's it's obviously got a genetic component. It's obviously got an environmental component, and then there's a sort of social genetic component, which is what my father used to talk about. That it's not real genes. It's maybe connected with genes at some much more kind of general level. That all these people who seem to favor education and challenge intellectually and things like that seem to have a much higher propensity of having kids who go on and make perhaps significant contributions and things. It's just because the environment in that local family group seems to favor these kind of things. And I think that may trigger these underlying other capabilities that are hidden there. And if you had an equivalent set of capabilities, but you didn't have parents that knew what STEM things were or something like that, the whole thing might have been missed. And I feel that I was gifted by the fact that I did have parents who both understood these kind of things at some level at least, and they encouraged it. So
I think along those same lines, the term that is often used is environmental enrichment. And environmental enrichment, not only at the high end, but also at the low end of performance, seems to be very good at bringing out things that otherwise people might not have realized they could do. So genetics, environment, we have a thing called culture, which stands at that interface.